and our other cousin's on right now, but let's see, she says driving to kids softball practice, so my camera is off. Sounds
Okay.
good. Cool.
Are now sharing. Go back to the beginning. Okay, so this is the history of Freemasonry. I am Patrick McCoy. I have a master's degree in international psychology. I'm also a PhD student in also international psychology, and I have a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology. And a little about, so the topics that we're going to be looking at is, we're going to start with Masonic tradition, which is, it's not the history of Freemasonry. It's kind of what the fraternity has drawn back to, the ancient times, the ancient brethren that are not necessarily connected, but for somehow it's made up the large part of the fraternity. In the 500 years, at least, we know that the fraternity has existed. Then we're going to talk about the legendary history, or the theories, because ultimately we don't know how Freemasonry started. You know, the theoretical, how operative Masons sort of became speculative Masons, we don't really have the knowledge on that, or at least, you know, to be sure. But we have a lot of fun theories, and we have a lot of interesting connect the dots type of things. I'm sure you guys, you know, the whole stories behind the Dan Brown novels and the National Treasure. It's honestly not that far off from what we kind of think might be, you know, a theoretical legendary history of Freemasonry. Then we're going to actually go into the documented history of Blue Lodge Masonry, which is what our main body of Masonry is. When we talk about Blue Lodge Masonry, it's the 3 degrees, the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason, where the Grand Lodge is. The main body of Masonry is what we call Blue Lodge. And that one has even kind of just piecing together all the little artifacts and the meeting minutes and the vague hearsay that constitutes a lot of our history, going back to at least the early 1600s. Even before our official start date of 1717, speculative Masonry at least predates that by 100 years or more. Then we have what we're calling the concordant bodies of Masonry. These are the York Rite, the Scottish Rite, the women Freemasonry, not to be confused with co-Masonry. I'll explain that when we get into it, but the women Masons, which share a common history with traditional Freemasonry. Also the Order of the Eastern Star. And then we have our youth orders, which are the Job's Daughters, the Rainbow Girls, and the D. Malay. Finally, I'm going to talk about specifically how Masonry came to California and how it was founded in the year 1850, and Central Coast Masonry that also has a long history. I'm actually in the library now at King David's Lodge in San Luis Obispo, which was the lodge itself was founded in 1870, and the building itself was built in 1913. So it has a long and rich history of just all its own. So here's sort of my history in Freemasonry. I get to put the PM at the end of my name, not to be confused with my actual initials of Patrick McCoy, but that stands for past master. So that means that I've served in a lodge as master. And, you know, I went through up the officer stations. I started as well, according to my records, I started as a marshal, but as far as I know, I started as a junior steward, which is the lowest one you can get. Went from junior steward to marshal, then went into junior warden, which is one of the pedestal officers, the top leadership, and then finally senior warden and master. And so from the year 2006, where I was raised to be a master mason, I was then a master in 2011, and then I received the distinction of being called past master. So that was Alhambra Lodge number 322, Free and Accepted Masons.
So are all of these levels that you go through based on knowledge, service, like what gets you to each tier?
So your initiation as a entered apprentice Mason starts with asking the fraternity to join. And that's usually a friend, you know, someone, maybe you're a family member. You have to come and say, I would like to be a Mason. Then after an extensive background check and initiation fees, this lifelong dedication is not free. You get to join the only longest living fraternity on earth. And you then will go through an initiation ceremony. You will receive a lecture that provides certain morals, virtues, knowledge that you must memorize a portion of. Then you are passed to Fellowcraft Mason, which is our second degree. Once again, you receive a certain lecture, which tonight I am actually delivering a second degree myself as Master of the Lodge. Usually it's the senior warden that will give second degrees, but we kind of had to shuffle a little bit. One of our brothers is in San Francisco right now with his family, so we kind of do that. As Master, you're expected to basically have memorized all 3 degrees, which I have. So I will be giving the lecture in the East for the second degree. And then after that, and I've made my necessary proficiency, I can then be raised as a Master Mason. And after that, you can be free to just be a Master Mason. In fact, you can be free to be an entered apprentice Mason. There are certain privileges that are from each one. The entered apprentice, they can't vote in certain things, but they can attend all the meetings. Some things you can only get as a Master Mason. We also, certain privileges are given depending on the lodge. Such as our lodge, we have a really nice rec room in the basement that Master Masons are allowed to use whenever they want, certain things like that. But there are practical things, and then there are spiritual and esoteric things that you get depending on how far you go into the craft. I have gone pretty far, but even I'm not done yet. So, I started almost 17 years ago. So as a Master Mason, then I am eligible to be appointed as an officer of the lodge, which I worked my way up through the chairs, although we had to skip a couple of things just because of how Masonry is kind of a dwindling fraternity now, but we're kind of trying to grow our membership, which is part of the reason why I'm giving this class actually. So, but as you can see from the top photos from the left, the third one over, you see me in a top hat and I'm quite young. That is me as Master of the Lodge of Alhambra number 322 in 2011. That's in Alhambra, California. The one immediately to the right is actually my installation as Master of this lodge, which is King David's Lodge number 322, and that's of this year. My title is Worshipful Master. That's, not to be implied that I need to be worshiped. I'm not worshiped. I'm full of worship for God. And so I am the Worshipful Master of this lodge. It could be considered that I'm like the CEO of this organization, which is actually a 501c10 nonprofit fraternity. And I'm responsible for the ultimate administration and delegation of duties for the entire year. Depending on the lodge, that can be a lot of work. In this case, this lodge is quite successful. And so I have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of philanthropy. We have a lot of social events. We have a lot of administration of our investments, of our building, and I'm ultimately looked to as the one responsible for it. So it's a lot of work, and it is a volunteer. In fact, we still have membership dues that we have to pay. So that's, kind of, what the dedication, if you ever hear someone who's the master of a lodge or a past master, they've made a lot of work in the craft, as we call it. Additionally, I am the part of the York Rite, and those are 3 bodies, which of course, when we get into the concordant bodies, I'll explain all those, but we have the Royal Arch Masons, which is the first 3 degrees of that one. I'm holding the office of scribe, which is the 3rd in line for the top officer of that chapter. Also, I'm in the Cryptic Council, Cryptic Masons. I'm the deputy master, which is, basically the 2nd in line. And the 3rd one, I've just received my degrees just last year in the Knights Templar, and I am starting my office. If you see on the bottom, on the far right, one of the lower members of that officer corps, and I'm the warder of the San Luis Obispo Commandery number 27. Just sort of going over the couple of pictures I didn't mention. The one on the left is me wearing the apron, traditional of the Royal Arch Mason. You'll see it's red as opposed to the blue aprons, which of course, I'll explain these in more detail. And then this one, the one next to it, I'm wearing the sojourner's uniform of the Order of Malta, which is part of the Knights Templar degrees. So that's kind of a little bit about me in terms of my direct experience with Freemasonry.
So when you're referring to God, are we talking like Judeo-Christian God, I'm guessing, or is it just like non-denominational, the all type God? Like, do you guys have a certain...
Well, and yes, it's a supreme being. It is a supreme being that we refer to specifically as the great architect of the universe, to the grand architect of the universe, because we're all speaking in masonry terms. It's all based on tools and symbols of actual stone masonry. And as I further go along, you'll sort of understand that part. Now, as the Knights Templar, I am Christian. So to be a Knights Templar, you need to actually profess a belief in Christ. That is the only order within Masonry that requires that. We do have certain symbols like the Holy Bible. This is actually a Masonic Bible, as what we call a rule and guide of our faith. But other lodges, such as ones in Muslim countries, they will have a Quran on theirs. It's just considered a holy book. Other people who aren't Muslim or Christian or anything like that, they will carry their own sacred book to be put on the altar when they take their obligations. So
do you guys get data in terms of like on a worldwide level, like what percentage affiliate with being Islam, what percentage affiliate with being Jewish, what percentage affiliate with being Sufi or Christian or Catholic? Or
so with with our kind of order, so the order starts with our local lodges, and then those are under either the state, like we have the Grand Lodge of California, and then with other parts of the world, they'll have their country lodges. Like the Philippines has one Grand Lodge. England has the United Grand Lodge of England, which actually used to be 2 Grand Lodges, and then they formed back to 1, which, I think in the next class, I'll be getting into the details of that, history of deviousness. But, Scotland has their own, Ireland has their own Grand Lodge, France has their own Grand Lodge, Iran has their own Grand Lodge. They're in exile and actually reside in California, but each country has their own data and they're kept secret. Like I have...
They're in exile from Iran, like Iran set put the kibosh on Freemasonry essentially. And so they're having to like operate out of California. Interesting. Okay.
Yes. And some of the countries, Italy, that I know specifically, and as we get into the history, I'll talk about these, but like Egypt, Italy, I think Germany finally reinstated their Freemasons, but World War II fascist countries basically wiped out Freemasons because they were autonomous. groups. And of course, you can't have that in a totalitarian regime, much like Iran. They wiped out Freemasonry in Iran. Egypt did the same thing in 1956 during the Six-Day War, because, as we'll find out in this class, our Masonic traditions could be considered pro-Semitic, and they were having, a war with Israel at the time. So, yeah, we have a few lodges in exile. We also have countries that had a Masonic history, but they were wiped out by the regimes that were in charge at one time or another. Otherwise, we have, lodges or grand lodges in exile. But so, as a worldwide fraternity, while we recognize each other, we don't carry the data of everybody. And as far as I know, there hasn't been an actual survey of religious denominations, even ethnic denominations, because we don't look at these things when you join. We don't look at your income. We don't look at your ethnicity, your race, at least anymore, which, when we talk about the concordant bodies, the Prince Hall Masons, that came out of, obviously our racist past. But now, today, we don't look at, race, ethnicity, religion, income, anything like that, because all you must do is believe in a supreme being of some sort, and you must not be a criminal. That's, or at least have a felony, depending on what it is. We're even, looking at certain things like drug use from 10 years ago. We don't consider you a danger to society or anything like that. So those are really, if you're able to pass a background check and have a belief in a supreme being, and then depending on the concordant body, like Blue Lodge only accepts men, the women lodges only accept women, and Orders Eastern Stars are only co-ed one. So that's those are the other somewhat restrictions depending on the order that you want to join. So Masonic tradition. So as I said, Masonic tradition is not our actual history, and everybody understands this, but what we do is call back into our, what would be considered a spiritual tradition. The ancient stonemasons that built the first Temple of Solomon, we consider that the origin or our Masonic tradition. And everything within the Blue Lodge is concentrated within the building of King Solomon's Temple. So the Masons there, everything that they supposedly did, they had a sacred brotherhood, and we're emulating that as much as possible.
So when they were building King Solomon's Temple, it wasn't them calling themselves the Freemasons. It was just eventually, like you said, in the 1700s, you guys came along and wanted to emulate what they had, like a group of spiritual, like brotherhood, building a temple of worship that had like certain hidden meanings and passages and stuff like that.
It's more complex than that. So, and that's what, we're discussing today is it wasn't, the fraternity itself were operative Masons at one time. But as to the Masonic tradition, there's no reason to believe that the operative Masons were anywhere remotely resemblant of the Masonic tradition of what supposedly these ancient stonemasons. However, the stonemasons, they were not Freemasons. So no, just short answer, the stonemasons who built the King Solomon's Temple were not free. They were in fact under the direct authority of one of what we call the Grand Masters of the Solomon's Temple. So as I show there, while there's no actual link between ancient stonemasons and modern Freemasons, our Masonic tradition forms the basis of what's called speculative Masonry. That is different between operative Masonry, which is the actual building of stone structures and using stone tools and the actual Masons. However, what we know is that there was a blending of that. So the operative Masons had within them, the ones that we are directly descended from, at least theoretically, had the kind of structure that we have today with entered apprentices and fellow crafts and master Masons, that they had certain secrets, they had initiation rites, they had secret code words and handshakes that we do today. That comes from the operative Masons that we go from. However, in speculative Masonry, we say that all those things came from the ancient stonemasons that built the first Temple of Solomon. And because, so the Temple of Solomon, that brings us to how we explain how this whole thing sort of came about. Built in 957 BCE, according to Masonic tradition, was under the auspices of three grand masters: Solomon, king of Israel; Hiram, king of Tyre; and Hiram Abiff, the widow's son. None of this is actually secret, because what we know is that we take this all from holy writings, which, you know, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament has the, you know, direct chronicling of what the Temple of Solomon was about. Mentioned all three of those men, and additionally Hiram Abiff, who we consider a third grand master of Freemasonry, was from the writings of Flavius Josephus, who was he was a great Jewish historian that we often reference in our rituals, the Antiquities of the Jews, circa 93 or 94 CE, also the Aramaic commentary on the Book of Esther. So these are the most ancient writings that we utilize within speculative Masonry. But, you know, the thing is, though, Hiram Abiff was not considered a grand master within the holy writings. He was actually an artificer of brass, and he was called on by Solomon to Hiram to form what we know of are the two main pillars that we see in the front of the temple. They were called Boaz and Jachin. And those also have a specific esoteric knowledge in them, and they're known to be, they're described completely in the Bible, that they're surmounted by balls on top that represent globes of the celestial sky and the celestial earth. The three gentlemen, as you see on the right, are supposedly our three grand masters: Solomon, king of Israel; Hiram, king of Tyre; and Hiram Abiff. They called themselves in the Bible brothers, brother Hiram of Tyre and brother King, Solomon. So we have accepted that as, within Masonic tradition, all of us are brothers. So the three grand masters were brothers. All the master masons were also brothers to them, and successively down the line. And so this brotherhood was then, within Masonic tradition, formed to build the house of the Lord. We have our own version of the retelling of the story within our third degree. We read in the holy writings that it was decreed in the wisdom and counsels of deity aforetime that a house should be built, erected to God, and dedicated to his holy name. We also learn from the same sacred source that David, king of Israel, desired to build the throne or build the house, but that in consequence of his reign being one of many wars and much bloodshed, that distinguished privilege was denied him. But he was not left without hope, however, for God promised that out of his loins would come a man adequate to the purpose of so great and glorious of undertaking. It goes on from there, but that is not the actual writings. If you read First Kings or Second Chronicles, that is from our Masonic tradition. We have our own lecture in the third degree that we explain the building of the Temple of Solomon, which we find is the foundation of our entire Masonic process, or our Masonic basis. And utilizing the sacred geometry, the measurements of the temple, where the different rooms were situated, the directions they were situated in, east to west, with the north being in darkness and the south always being at the high 12 or high noon. All these things are taken to have then esoteric meanings that we then delve into within our degrees. And then some of us, like myself, go a little bit further and start researching even more. So like, yes, go
ahead. The two columns, the Boaz and Yakim, like, I don't know too much about them, but I do know that like in the tarot deck, it's the high priestess that has both of those on either side. So like, why would there be that on, but this one's like so male dominated. So like, why would the high priestess have the B and the J in the tarot deck?
Well, that, fortunately with my esoteric background, I also sort of dabbled into the Kabbalah and high magic and Goetia and various things like that. That was the Rider-Waite deck, and that was taken from Aleister Crowley's teachings, as far as I know. And he was looking into Kabbalistic writings when he formed a lot of his esoteric knowledge, and he found that a balance of the god and the goddess and the priest and the priestess and these things like that, they were required. This, of course, ultimately still goes back to higher orders of Freemasonry, in like Wicca, like a lot of the neo-pagan movements, they drew on Masonic traditions and rituals that we know that like Alan Gardner was initiated as a Freemason, and then he took that and put it into his Wiccan tradition, and thus came down to everything else. But as far as I know, yeah, in ancient times we didn't really have high priestesses for the most part. There were a few offices, like in Egypt, the Great Royal Wife, who catered to Amun. We have Hestian virgins and various priestesses, roles like that. I think the Oracle at Delphi was always female. Certain things like that, and Egypt always, even especially, they required a balance in all things: a father, a mother, and a son, or a child. Actually, it could be a goddess in that holy triad. So what I would say is the amalgamation of the balance of the male and the female that we see going from really ancient Egypt into Judaism and thus into the successive things in the Age of Enlightenment and going down into neo-paganism is always about a balance of things. So that is why, we see the high priestess standing in front of the two pillars.
So who are Boaz and Yakim, like whether it's from a history perspective or an esoteric perspective, like what's their legend?
Well, no, the names Boaz and Yakim, or as we still call them, Jachin, but Boaz and Yakim, you're correct on the pronunciation. That actually are just names are meaning strength and to establish.
Okay.
And so the actual the pillars of brass in Masonic tradition are saying that in strength we establish this house and kingdom of God forever.
Okay.
Yeah, they weren't actual people, but the name, strength and establish is what.
Okay, so it's just like words that mean those two things.
Yes, and so they named these pillars after them as a symbol that this establishes his house. And we read in the book of Samuel, actually, it was Samuel was the prophet that guided David and told him that God wanted a house. And then, later on it was, told Solomon this. So yeah, that's kind of where we got, where we have the idea of the Temple of Solomon.
Okay, and it was supposed to hold the Ark of the Covenant, correct?
It did, yes. At least legendarily, that, or the historians in the Bible and the Torah, they all say that, or the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles, they all say that in fact, it was 2nd Chronicles chapter 6. They had, that lays out exactly when David took it from the tabernacle in Jerusalem and carried it up to Mount Moriah. So this is the location of the temple. It's if you look on the far lower, I don't think I have it But if you look lower, you'll see Jerusalem over by the large green spot. That's actually the Dead Sea. And so you see Jerusalem, and right next to it, you see the Mount Moriah. So what we know within our Masonic tradition and the biblical references is that when Solomon took the throne of Israel, Hiram of Tyre, hearing this and knowing that he was established as a friend, an ally of David, David actually contacted Hiram of Tyre and established the relationship. So when Hiram of Tyre heard that Solomon was king of Israel and he was desiring to build the house of God, he reached out to him and wanted to take part in this auspicious thing. So Solomon, worked with Hiram of Tyre, and what we know in the biblical references is that Hiram of Tyre entered into this solemn covenant and said, I will work with you and I will provide masons, myself, my crew, and then your crew will all come together under one unified force. And then Solomon then asked he said, okay, Solomon will provide the money, but you will pay the craft. So then he provided, basically the money for materials and for men, but then Hiram needed to provide the timbers from Byblos. So timbers from Byblos all across the ancient world, that was the thing to have no matter where you were, as long as you were within the certain sphere of this. Egyptians got all their timber from Byblos or Lebanon, and so they were transported from Byblos all the way down to what we see as Joppa. If you look down along the coast, Joppa, it was then conveyed by land to Jerusalem. So, and where they were put together. So what we also know is that since Hiram of Tyre provided the workers and the professional masons, the master masons, as well as Hiram of Biff, who was what we believe in our Masonic traditions was the architect of the work. We then know also from historical references that this was a Phoenician style temple. So Phoenicia is a sort of a loosely based maritime empire, if you will. It wasn't quite an empire, but they all had similar culture, similar values, similar language, the Phoenician alphabet, similar deities. This was separate from Canaan, which, as you can see, that's where we see most of the Semitic peoples, the tribes of Israel, or the tribes of Abraham were mostly living at the time. So the fact that Phoenicia and Canaan entered into this solemn pact to build this one temple to a single deity was kind of a big thing. Henotheism wasn't that much of a following, or following one god yet believing in many gods. That was not something that was.
Pause there, because that gets my mind going in so many different directions. Okay, first of all, though, didn't one of them marry into like an Egyptian family, and that's how they got a lot of their like building practices? I can't remember if it was Solomon or Hiram of Biff, but like I think one of them married some Egyptian woman so that way he could have access to their knowledge in terms of how to build like a secret chamber for the Ark of the Covenant kind of thing.
You're right on schedule with my lecture here. That's exactly one of the things. Yes, he married Solomon married an Egyptian princess and also provided a private apartment for her within the temple. That was chronicled in First Kings. Additionally, we do know that Phoenicia and Canaan, by the time of the building of King Solomon's temple, were part of the Egyptian empire. So throughout the New Kingdom.
Sorry, but where my mind started to go a little bit like, okay, curious, was the fact that wasn't this supposed to be more of like because when I think of King Solomon's temple, I think of Old Testament Jewish traditions, like monotheism. But if he's marrying into an Egyptian family, and I'm guessing they're still more polytheistic in a lot of ways, yet they're both agreeing to build this like house of God together. Like you were saying, that like merger is really interesting. So the Ark of the Covenant, like as far as a document goes, is it a it's hiding a document? Like the Ark
Of,
itself, the structure itself is hiding a document. I was always
yes.
under the impression, without giving it too much thought, that it was hiding the Old Testament, or like, you know, a decree from God, so to speak. And again, I always thought it was more of a Jewish thing. So I thought it was like a copy of the Torah or the Old Testament. But I'm guessing that's not the case, considering they're like merging forces in terms of monotheism and polytheism. So like what document was in the Ark of the Covenant?
So we know that the first things placed within the Ark of the Covenant was the fragments of the Ten Commandments. So when Moses came down, saw his people worshiping the golden calf, he threw down the tablets in disgust, and I think the earth cracked open and destroyed the cow and some of the people as well. So the first things that were placed within the Ark of the Covenant were those. Also then, Aaron had chronicled Deuteronomy, which was the laws of Moses, and those were also placed within the Ark of the Covenant.
Okay.
Itself was made from the Egyptian gold that was given to them for their contract, which we could even go back further and see the. So my lecture on the Masonic traditions of ancient Egypt is something I didn't intend on putting in here, but I can give you some of the background on that. But we know that, so at least by the New Kingdom, we can all know that Phoenicia and Canaan were part of the Egyptian Empire, and what the Egyptians did is they put their culture on everybody else. So supplantation was their common practice. They put in their own architecture. They put in their own culturally significant things, not necessarily the gods or the religion, because, well, one is they weren't strictly polytheistic. Egyptians were considered what's called monolatry, and that's saying that the gods have some sort of connection, either by family or by power. Like Ra is the ultimate sun god. He then went and mutated into several different gods: Amun Ra, Khepra, Atum Ra, etc. So what you saw is their monolatry, which is similar to henotheism, which is believing in one God or worshiping one God, but not believing in one God. Monotheism didn't happen until about the 1st century, roughly before 50 BC. That was when the Jews were in exile in Babylon. That was when they were exposed to the writings of Zoroaster. Zoroaster actually did some psilocybin mushrooms and came up with that there's only one type of good in this universe, or one God, Ahura Mazda, and then one demon or one devil, and that's Angramanya. So before that, they still had the idea that there's one God to be worshipped, the God that that saved us from the Holy Land, or saved us from Egypt, and that was Yahweh, or Yahweh. Now, even going further back, so while they were in Egypt, the archaeology shows that they were bonded. So they weren't slaves; they were actually bonded under a certain contract to build granary cities for the Hyksos Empire. So the Hyksos were these Semitic peoples that, from Canaan. They came and they took over the north of Egypt, killed the pharaoh there, appointed a Theban prince in his place, and they had a kind of a tenuous peace for about 150 years. Toward the end there, they started falling apart, and the archaeology suggests that the Hebrews were indebted or indentured to these Hyksos to build the granary cities of Tel Adaba and Ra-Emti. It's often mistranslated as Ramesses, but it's not Per-Ramesses. It's actually a place called Ra-Emti, which was, I think it was Avaris and Tel Adaba. So those were the two cities that they built. When they finished building those cities, they asked the pharaoh, who was a Hyksos, who was Apepi the first, I think, or they think, that to let them go. They finished their job and they wanted their contract fulfilled, which was a certain amount of gold, and they were able to leave. He said no. We then started having the 10 plagues of Egypt, which generally happened every year when the Nile flooded. But this time there was a problem with Thera erupted. And Thera caused 3 days of darkness, caused rivers to swell and gas to be erupted from earthquakes and things like that. So it's easy to kind of conflate the 10 plagues against the Hyksos pharaoh to the circumstances of the falling out of the eruption of Thera. So the deity that they had started, his name was Apepi the First, and that is the demon serpent of Apep, which was an enemy of Osiris, or Seth, and then the enemy of Osiris. So the Hebrews then worshipped a form of Osiris that was a cycle of the moon, which was called Yahweh. That's the literary theory, that the god Yahweh, or Yahweh, came from the Egyptian god Yah, which is the moon. So there's yet another sort of tie-in to ancient Egypt for that.
And there's usually a lot more emphasis on like the sun, though, when it comes to like one ultimate supreme god. It's usually more sun related. So it's kind of curious like why they would go with the moon at that point.
Well, so the moon was still also very important in Egypt. So them being, in Egypt and being, inundated with Egyptian, iconography, the moon is still just as important as the sun. In fact, even in Masonic tradition, the sun, moon, and master of the lodge are considered the three lesser lights of Masonry. So the moon governs the night, the sun governs the day. This comes from ancient Egypt as the god Thoth, or Jahutya. He was the light of the moon, and the light of the moon was considered the light of the sun that kept the darkness away at nighttime. So when the sun went down, made his underworld journey, the moon came out to keep away the demons. So the moon was actually just as important in ancient belief.
But it's also like derivative light of the sun, like you were talking about before. What was that called? Like monotheistic and then something else?
So we have monolatry, which is what the Egyptians,
okay.
Yeah, which is one source of God, like Ra, the sun god Ra. Then you had henotheism, which was the worship of one God, but still believing there were other gods. And that was what Israel had during the time of Solomon. During the time of David, there were actually 3 gods that were worshipped within the city of David. And then, so he had to then build a separate temple for Yahweh up on a mountain, which the mountain of Mount Moriah was where Abraham was about to offer up his son Isaac. And also David, when he went to buy that land, it was from it was a threshing station. He bought that land and met an angel, which then he wrestled him for, he met and appeased this angel that was going to actually wipe out Israel. So at least, that's the myth of it. So that's where, Mount Moriah was the chosen place of it. So the land was bought by David. He came upon an angel who he had to wrestle for 3 days and won. And then they built this sacred place where, that's where Abraham first heard from God and said to sacrifice your son, but he didn't end up doing that. So that's where, that's the sacred place of the Temple of Solomon. But it was a Phoenician style temple, and Phoenicia got their architecture from Egypt. And as you said, there was more to it than that goes even further back, that there was an Egyptian princess. She came in and provided more information and more architectural ideology within this Temple of Solomon. So it wasn't an Israelite temple in design. It was a Phoenician temple in design, but it was also an Egyptian temple in design. So as we can see here, the typical ancient Egyptian or the Temple of Solomon, we have starting with the brazier that was on the outside, what they call the brazen sea. Going up the steps, you had the 35 cubits and then 8 cubits that made up the 2 brazen pillars. Then going inside, you had the front aisle or porch, and then you had the middle chamber is what we usually call that. And then finally, the sanctum sanctorum or holy of holies. So that is where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. Now there was an altar in the middle chamber that supposedly Hiram Abiff placed what he called the trestle board, which is where he laid his designs down, because every day he went out into the temple, viewed the work, decided what we needed to change, what they needed to add for strength or for ornaments, as we say. And he laid the designs upon the trestle board so that the masters can come in and see the work, and then they can go and deliver it to the rest of the brethren they were working with. So what we see in the typical ancient Egyptian temple is that we have a pylon. The pylons, which were these large structures in the front of the temple that kept basically evil or enemies away. Had a big door, that it was they didn't have to really worry about people attacking the temple because Egypt was well fortified, but this was more of a spiritual thing. They had a door, and then they had these big pylons that kept evil out, or impurity out, is what they believed in, purity and impurity. Then you had a main hall, or what we saw as the porch, that only the least initiated or the lowest initiated could enter. And that's the same thing with what we say is the court, or the court of offerings. People that could not afford to go into the temple, or that lacked the necessary purity to enter the temple, couldn't enter. In ancient Egyptian temples, they had ears that were carved on the outside of the temples that people who couldn't afford to come inside or were too dirty, they could tell God what they needed and it would listen. The temple itself was considered alive with special ritual called the opening of the mouth. But and which we actually see the opening of the mouth was utilized in different formats to activate certain things to be divine, basically. Like the Ark of the Covenant, given Moses was a member of the Egyptian court, whether it was Hyksos or not, they adopted the same kind of religion. His priests that we see within Exodus kind of lay out the exact same kind of thing that you see within an ancient Egyptian ritual. So the Ark of the Covenant was divine. It had a divine power within it, much like a temple would have a divine power within it. So within the court of offerings, you then go past that and you go into the hypostyle hall. That basically means a columned hall. And that is what we saw, the middle chamber. There's an altar there. Within the hypostyle hall, that is actually a barrier between the inner chamber and the outer chamber. So these columns, which we know the Temple of Solomon had a certain number of columns. Actually, it was 1,453 columns. That we have to memorize that as being master of the watch. 1,453 columns. So the columns themselves were considered a magical barrier to keep out negative spirits or impurities. So these columns filtered out the purity, so that only the most pure can go inside the inner chamber, which was considered the sanctuary within an Egyptian temple, or the sanctum sanctorum, or holy of holies, within the Temple of Solomon.
So is this how you guys have like inspiration within Freemasonry in terms of like your different levels of attainment of certain knowledge kind of thing?
Well, those of us who are of an esoteric nature, yes. Not every Mason has any care for esoteric, knowledge. In my opinion, the best ones do, but that's obviously my personal, based on what I know of the history of Masonry and how integral esoteric knowledge was. And most of us who go to the different bodies and hold offices and stick with the work and do the necessary memory work, we look into all that esoteric things. So yeah, I mean, that's what we utilize, is all of these different, like the 1453 columns, the pilasters, the structure of the temple, the tools that we use, all have an esoteric symbol to them. They're symbols on improving ourselves and attaining that higher order of consciousness. So any other questions? Because we're going to get into some like the historical stuff a little more, but I don't mind answering any more questions about regarding some of the esoteric stuff.
So is the highest one the 33rd degree Mason? So would that be like, if you had to make it esoteric, correlation, like that would be the person who gets to know like what's in the Ark of the Covenant, like they get to hang out with the Ark of the Covenant if you're a 33rd degree Mason? No.
So the Scottish Rite is the 33rd degree, and the 33rd degree is actually, you're invited to it. So most of the Scottish Rite Masons only can make it to the 32nd degree. And Scottish Rite Masonry is actually kind of a cobbling together of different initiation rituals throughout history. There's an ancient Egyptian one. There's stuff from India. It's the Scottish Rite is actually one of the younger rites. It's not the youngest rite. That's the Order of the Eastern Star, and they're only about 100 years old. But Scottish Rite is not as old as, that one came about in like the late 1700s, maybe. But that has a lot of knowledge. I mean, it does. I haven't gone through it yet, but a lot of Scottish Rite Masons are my friends. And, we know these 32 degrees are all different initiation rites, all from different cultures and different religions and different things like that. So you do receive a lot of knowledge in those degrees, but it's not as structured as like the York Rite or even Blue Lodge Masonry. So none of the, yeah, go ahead.
What would be the equivalent within Freemasonry of the level of getting to be with the Ark of the Covenant? Like if you were to make that parallel?
That would be the Master Masons.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, or the Grand Master, but the Master Masons, yes. So yeah, we're able to go into the Sanctum Sanctorum,
Gotcha.
the Holy of Holies. So we enter that the Sanctum Sanctorum during our 3rd degree. Okay. So that's kind of what we see as our Masonic tradition. So we're now moving to our Operative Masonry. So as I said, we don't know how exactly Operative Masonry and Speculative Masonry sort of, came from it. But we have some ideas, and we know Operative Masonry has a lot of what we see within our modern craft. So in the Middle Ages, it was, stonemasons were very rare. They only worked on castles and cathedrals. Those are things that were made of stone. Most things were made of brick or sod or wood, but stone was a very highly specialized craft, and thus needed a lot of training, a lot of skill, especially moving those giant blocks, and it's very dangerous. Needed a lot of specialized tools for it. Our Operative Masonry goes back to the Middle Ages of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Ireland's kind of left off a lot, but some of the oldest artifacts of Masonry are found in Ireland within the 1600s. So it's important to see Ireland. And in fact, Irish Masonry is what started French Masonry. So, again, Ireland is pretty important to keep. So, as I said, castles, so the most upper echelons of society, the priesthood, the aristocracy, the royalty, they needed stonemasons to build their homes and their places of worship. So this required, since there were so few master masons, they had to go travel a lot, travel across the islands of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and provide their expertise to these richer upper echelons. They were skilled labor, though. Even though they had a lot of knowledge, they were still skilled labor. They were most likely illiterate. They knew their craft, though, and it's like an engineer, or a mechanic. I'd say more of a mechanic. A mechanic wouldn't necessarily read books on Aristotle or look at avant-garde art or anything like that. But without him, you wouldn't get a car to move. So these are like the highly skilled mechanics. And so what they would do is when they traveled to different project sites, and it would take several years to build these things, they assembled in what was called lodges. That's where they would live, they would eat, they would store their tools. They would then go ahead and train their fellow craft masons and entered apprentices. Of course, they wouldn't train them everything. Otherwise, they wouldn't, so they wouldn't be masters, and those took years of training. So this is our operative masonry. So this is what fundamentally changed operative masonry from a skilled labor class to a secretive clandestine, secretive clandestine organization.
Okay, kind of a random tangent, but the last slide totally made me think about it. So with your comprehensive knowledge of like masonry and based on that area of the world, like any idea how Stonehenge, like if you had to put Stonehenge, the story of it, including the erection of Stonehenge, into a nutshell explanation, what would you say?
So it's a Paleolithic monument that evolved in several different ways. So it started out as a place to venerate ancestors. It moved on to being tombs of ancestors. It evolved into being an astronomical calendar. It has the properties of it are built as such that it gives off sound, a unique sound, a unique feel. The stones that were involved, some of them actually give off their own heat, special colors. The way it's set up with the acoustics will have an echoing effect. This has been, proven within different experiments, and it was built by the power of levers, basically.
So kind of like in Egypt, like how they supposedly got all the blocks where they were supposed to be, it was just like a mad lever system.
No, actually, in Egypt they used sleds and friction, or the lack of friction. So they were able to use brute force, but they used they used water or fats or something that would sled rocks or sled the stones into specifically things, and ramps. And these were specialized ramps. Even with our new, we just found in Egypt that new tunnel or that corridor that they found in Egypt, that is a prevailing theory that was actually used to build the upper echelons of the pyramid itself. So they actually pushed the rocks into place through that specialized tunnel.
Interesting. So back to Stonehenge though, even with a lever system, how do you get that third top horizontal rock on top? Even with levers?
So that one, they're pretty sure that it was done by burying the, sort of lifting it up with pushing earth underneath it.
Okay. So like Stonehenge should be below the grade of the rest of the land that it was built around.
No. So they built the grade up, and they were able to push it into place. So again, they levered. So they built kind of mud ramps, as far as I know, and built up the earth, and were able to then lever because what they kind of used as in, at least with the best experiments that they did, they kind of made like a rowing system where they had these two large branches on either side, and they were actually able to pull them to move these things on further tracks. So they just kept doing that, moving it across 100 miles or something. But the one thing, it's like, well, why would, that would take forever. Why would you do that? Well, you didn't have all these extra distractions you have today. They didn't read, they didn't have entertainment. Their people in charge told them to do something, and they just did it all day. That was, kind of what they did. So looking in the most simplistic terms, it, as long as the math and the engineering, and they had those kind of materials during the, at the time, it's relatively simple to see how these things came about. I know I'm not too far into conspiracy theories when it comes to building things. It's got to be the science, and the math, and the materials have to all match. Like they thought that the pyramids were built with kites and pulleys, and it's like, no, they didn't have kites and pulleys, especially nylon kites. They didn't have these things, so you can't accept that as a reason. But ultimately, I think the time involved is due to the fact that they had food, and they didn't have distractions. So they didn't read, they didn't entertain them, have entertainment like we do today. They just had doing this all day long, and they got food from people in charge, and that's just what their living was.
Yeah, they could dedicate all their resources to it.
Right. And since Stonehenge, and we know this, Stonehenge was about ancestry, as opposed to, because they found the remains of Woodhenge, which was actually nearby. And that was a monument to the living. So and the fact that they buried people there, and the way that it astronomically lines up to the winter solstice, and when the sun rose, and subsequent folklore, they were able to know that it was a monument to the dead and the ancestors, which we know from anthropology, from history. The closest spirit to you were the people who just died. Our first deities, as you were actually spirits of the dead. And then as time progressed, and we had, resources, food, and, we didn't have to worry about dying all the time, and we can actually sit back and think about these things, our brains evolved into believing in these greater powers that are more alien to us, which is probably why a lot of people believe in aliens today, because it's still, they can't believe that there's some mythical being out there, but there may be physical beings that are, crazy looking with giant heads and things like that built all the stuff that we could never do in our lifetime. But sorry, going into anthropology.
No worries.
The Statute of Labourers in 1351. So the Black Plague, usually this is common knowledge, it wiped out a third of England, or the third of Europe, and caused, they were mostly the labor, the labor peasantry, those are the ones who weren't able to protect themselves from fleas and rats, and so they all died out. So the labor force being so small, it would give then the labor force the power to set their own wages. Well, Parliament, the elite couldn't have that, so they passed laws that said you have a maximum wage to pre-plague levels, and you are not allowed to get anything more. Despite the fact that skilled labor was few and far between, and they would have had, a lot of, exorbitant prices that they would have been able to pay. Well, they also then limited movement of people in search of better working conditions. So it's like, well, you have to stay here, and, you can only make this much money. So then these skilled master masons who were used to making their living, traveling to foreign countries and, receiving master masons wages, which, is part of our Masonic tradition. They were unable to do that legally. But at the same time, all these rich people needed their, needed their stone castles and their manor houses and their cathedrals, and they needed the Master Masons. Well, the Master Masons, you couldn't distinguish them right off, right from each other. So they created this clandestine, system to recognize each other, to be able to travel out and to, be able to tell who you're able to trust, and who you can't trust, because, it could be a fine or it could be execution. You don't know what, in 1351, they were brutal people. So they created this system of underground, Freemasons who were free to travel the country, but they had to do it in secret. And so
Black market Masons.
Yes, black market Masons, which is kind of what Freemasonry, we're all about our secrets and our secrecy. We're not all about that anymore, but that's where the whole idea of secrecy most likely came from, which again, this is still theoretical. I mean, history of Freemasonry, I can't, say this is exactly what happened, but this is the prevailing idea of what probably brought these secrets, a secret Freemason to happen. So we have these operative Masons that are, they have initiation rites, they have secret handshakes, they have secret passwords, they were able to travel in foreign countries in secret and have these lodges. So how did we get the speculative Mason? How is it that I'm not someone who spreads cement and, puts up blocks and, but I'm an esoteric, student of arts and sciences, things that, going back to the Temple of Solomon, which the average operative Mason would have had no idea to do, because in 1351, they had just published an English version of the Bible, and it was only available in France. So an operative Mason, being illiterate and not having access to a Bible in their own language, wouldn't know much about King Solomon's temple, let alone all these specific details that we have today. And we know that these details were existent in 1600. So where did they come from?
Isn't it symbolic in nature? Like, I always thought, like, okay, it used to be you're actually physically building structures, but then like the more you infuse knowledge and like the Age of Enlightenment on it, the more it's about like using that knowledge to build a culture. Like,
Right.
you're using thoughts and ideas to like build
Exactly.
and shape the future culture.
Yeah, and that's where we come with the speculative Mason. But we don't know how the operative became the speculative. We don't know where the Age of Enlightenment, because as you see, that's the 16th to the 18th centuries. We don't know how this, got put into the craft, so to speak. We know that we know sort of that the clandestine nature could be from these operative Masons, and they had their code words, and they had lodges, and you're able to get some of that structure. Master Mason, entered apprentice, and fellowcraft were all Middle Ages, style operative Masonry. But where did the idea that these were the same kind of Masons in the ancient Temple of Solomon? Where did they know that it had 1,453 columns and 2,906 pilasters hewn from the finest Parian marble? We don't, operative Masons would have had no knowledge of that. So what we have to know is, where did that come from? And we have two theories on that. The Knights Templar, which is always fun, and the Age of Enlightenment, how it was infused within that one. So just sort of giving you the Knights Templar theory is what they call it. It's a little far-fetched, but it's still a great one to look at. So we have, the beginning of the Knights Templar being the poor fellow soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, going to their downfall with the arrest, by King Philip the Fourth of France, torturing and confessions of heresy, burned at the stake. the dissolution of the order by Pope Clement. So 1312 is when supposedly the Templars ended. At the time, we know that a large amount of gold went missing and a large amount of the Templars went missing. Some of them got folded into different knighthoods and chivalric orders, at, like the Knights of Columbus and so on and so forth. But there's still a lot of missing Knights Templar to be accounted for, as well as gold. Dan Brown and National Treasure had the idea. This one is, the Templar theory of Freemasonry is not even related, but the 15 ships of the Knights Templar that escaped to America and brought their the treasure of Oak Island and all that stuff. That was one of the Templar theories, and which is Holy Blood, Holy Grail, I think is the book. It's on the shelf over here. Yeah, Born in Blood, that was the one. Our library has great books like that. But so the legend of the Knights Templar into Freemasons started in 1314, where they fled to Scotland to assist Robert the Bruce against England in the Battle of Bannockburn. And then they went to go live on islands on the east coast, west coast of Scotland. And then suddenly they became Freemasons on the east coast. So let's delve into that a little bit. So the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. So it was founded in 1119, and it was an order of monks that were traveling to the Holy Land, and they needed to learn to fight because, basically they were robbed. So they learned to fight and defend themselves and have gold. They ended up in Jerusalem and established their order on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which was also where they specifically did it, was supposedly the stables of King Solomon's temple. So then they took that as, they were then tied to the Temple of Solomon, and that's why it's called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. So they were, as I said, a monastic brotherhood. They were monks. They called themselves brothers. They were, a strict brotherhood. They had certain, things like they wore their armor most of the time. They wore their white gloves all the time, except to take communion, which we do in some of our ceremonies today, wearing white gloves. So you can sort of see some of the parallels between Freemasons and Knights Templar, which is why this theory is so popular. But they formed a monastic brotherhood of fighters that were protecting pilgrims during the Crusades. They then established a network of communication so that Templar Knights in France or England or wherever the start of pilgrims were could then communicate with the main order in Jerusalem. And at that point, they also then created a fiat currency where they were able to then have a note that said, okay, I have such and such gold in this bank or this holding in the Knights Templar, and thus I am able to then draw on that in the one in Jerusalem. And of course, being knights, they were able to carry gold and protect people. And then they opened this up to other people to draw on their banking system. So they created a banking network, and which also then grew their holdings exponentially, because of course they can take a small fee while the monks themselves had to take a vow of poverty. The order itself was able to hold the vast gold holdings of these pilgrims, who in many cases were rich people, and they were tourists going to the Holy Land. They were then set up with a dispensation from the Pope. They were papal bulls, and they were part of the armies of the church. And so they had this really great privileged life for several hundred years. Well, all good things must come to an end, and this one came by the name of Saladin. I didn't put it in there, but the Saladin was the Caliph of Jerusalem. And due to one reason or another, there's some movies on it. Kingdom of Heaven is really great. Orlando Bloom is, don't remember his name, Liam Neeson. It was a great movie, but yeah, there were some instigations going on between the King of Jerusalem and the Caliph of Jerusalem, and eventually Saladin had won. So they were left. They left in exile. Their main order of the Grand Master, led by, in the most recent part, was Jacques de Molay.
Where did they have the gold? So like you said, they had kind of like their own versions of Fort Knox, so to speak,
Yes.
that they made like fiat notes from.
Right.
Where were those held at?
Everywhere. So all of their holdings, they had different orders, or chapters, and each one had their own supply of gold, or usually gold, money, precious jewels, whatever. It was still directly on a precious jewel, silver, gold, standard. So each different, enclave or conclave had their own, money, which also supported them, fed them, made sure they had weapons, horses. Every Knight Templar had 2 horses, which, I mean, they're expensive no matter, what decade you live in. So after the fall of Jerusalem, they weren't fighting. They weren't, doing, they were getting involved in some local politics. One specifically was they supported a coup in Cyprus, which was a relative of King Philip IV of France, and he was deposed. So King Philip was not happy with the Templars. There was also the hearsay regarding their secret initiation rites. And of course, kings don't like secrets that are kept from them. So that just burgeoned his distrust of the Templars. And it probably didn't help that he was also in debt to the Templars for a large sum of money. No one likes to talk about it, especially King Philip, but most likely it was he went after the Templars because he was indebted to them. So he did not want to be beholden to the Templars.
So when they were dismantled, though, like obviously the decentralized pockets of gold and treasures, so to speak, like didn't get affected because it wasn't under just like one jurisdiction. And even if it was, the people, the powers that be, didn't necessarily know where it was.
It was there. I mean, they knew where the holdings were. I mean, it's kind of like, you go to the bank, you go to Fort Knox, you go to the Federal Reserve, you know where the money is. Yeah. Whether or not you can get it because, you've got a highly trained, fighter, warrior, paladin classes, you're not going to be able to get it from them. However, they were also very integral to the government. They were dispensated by the Pope, and the church in Rome ran everything within the Holy Roman Empire and the Europe, and they were all beholden to the Catholic Church at the time. So, and when the king shows up at your door and demands to arrest you, you can't say no necessarily. I mean, it's like
not successfally.
No, I mean, if I suddenly, if suddenly the police show up here and put me under arrest and I'm pulled away right now, I'm not going to fight them. I'm like, I am part of a large organization myself of Freemasons, and we have resources and we have connections in the community and things like that. But if the law comes knocking at the door, I'm going to cooperate. So Friday the 13th, 1307, which is why we get Friday the 13th is an unlucky number or unlucky day. Jacques de Molay and several of his other knights were arrested by agents of King Philip IV, then tortured and forced to sign confessions of heresy. The heresy included things like worshiping the mummified head of John the Baptist, spitting on the cross, rubbing their backsides on the cross, even some sort of strange worship of the Baphomet or the Baphomet, which didn't exist. I mean, it was a weird word that Jacques de Molay was written down under duress, which he later, before he was finally burned at the stake, as you see on that picture. He then recanted his confession of heresy, and pretty much all of the almost all of the Templars that were arrested and tortured and charged with heresy and confessed were all really old guys at the time. You know, it'd been quite a few years since the Crusades. They were all older men. A lot of them, of course, were administrators, so they didn't see battle for some years, and so they were easily able to be coerced by torture. So they were executed by burning at the stake for heresy. It was then the next year, 2 years later, that they were officially disbanded by Pope Clement V, and the various governments that were, housing, because even the Grand Master lived on land that was owned by King Philip. So they were all at the pleasure of the royalty or the church to exist. So once they were disbanded, everything was then confiscated. King Philip was able to get a substantial amount. Other kings of the countries got a substantial amount, similar to King Henry VIII when he broke away from the Catholic Church, just raided all of the monasteries, in his country and took that to the crown. Great influx of money, basically. But some of it went missing. Some of it, a large amount of troops went missing. They had some ships. They had network and connections. And so some of them did disappear with some of the money. So here's the legend of the Freemasons. The Templars they flee France, got on a ship to Scotland. So the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. So as you see, it's like 2 years later. Robert the Bruce was fighting a war against England for independence. This was started under basically there was no king. He was an Earl of Bruce at when the war started against King Edward the Longshanks, as they called him. So he was battling his son at the time for independence. The thing is, we know that Robert the Bruce did not have the best army, and somehow he was able to win the Battle of Bannockburn. He didn't have a heavy cavalry. He didn't have his troops were all untrained. They didn't have the best weaponry. Yet somehow he won. So the legend is that in the afternoon, a bunch of Templars just sort of showed up out of nowhere and won the day for them. Then they disappeared again. And it's said within the legend that they went into exile on the islands of the west coast of Scotland, which I think they're like the Shetlands and the Shetland Islands, somewhere around there. But they then somehow stayed exiled for 80 years.